Welcome to the Automotive Diagnostic Podcast. We're going to explore ways to sharpen our diagnostic skills, find learning resources, and hear from experts in the automotive field. This episode is brought to you by L1 Automotive Training and Keith Perkins. If you're looking for education on module programming, J2534, EEPROM work, key and immobilizer, electrical diagnostics, or drivability diagnostics, Keith has a website, l1training.com, that's got over 60 hours of training videos on all those subjects and more. When I first started out doing mobile, I utilized Keith's videos on module programming in J2534 in order to get my head wrapped around what I would need for the tooling, the computers, the software setups, what kind of obstacles I would be up against when I'm out there programming modules on cars. And it was a huge benefit to me. And I continue to use the training videos that he has on his website. So I strongly recommend checking out l1training.com. The link is in the show notes. Hey, what's going on, automotive world? Welcome to another episode of the Automotive Diagnostic Podcast. My name is Sean Tipping, and I'll be your host once again for this week's episode. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm going to be talking about General Motors 8-speed transmissions, and specifically the programming that goes into a vehicle after replacement of one of these transmissions. You will find that 9 and 10 speed transmissions are going to be very similar, although I've only done a handful of those. I've done a lot of the 8 speeds. So most of what I talk about today is going to be in reference to the 8-speed transmission that you find in the pickup trucks and SUVs, but you can take this information and use it on the 9 and 10 speeds as well. They have a similar setup, and the 10 speeds are used in the trucks. I just haven't seen, I think I've only done one 10 speed programming, and then the 9 speeds are used in the front wheel drive applications like an Impala or something like that, and I've only done 2 or 3 of those. So anyways, the reason I'm doing this is these are problematic transmissions, like lots of what GM makes and just lots of transmissions. In general, we do a lot of the programming, right? The shops do the replacement of the trans because enter X problem, whatever problem that they have, they're replacing these things, and then they call us in to do the programming afterwards. And it's a little bit of, I wouldn't even say it's a little bit of a process. It's fairly easy if you know what to do. These do take a little bit longer than the 6-speed transmissions if you want to do everything correctly. Again, not that much time involved, but there is some knowledge and understanding and some things you want to be aware of. And that's what I'm covering today. So maybe you do these already, or like, oh, this is easy. I just put in the number and I'm good to go. Again, there's just a few caveats and a few things I want to point out, and some ways that you can avoid trouble for either you or your customer if you're doing programming on these. And I actually learned some stuff looking up the detailed information on these transmissions. Like, I had done plenty of programming on these 8 speeds, and there was some stuff that I wasn't aware of and had just kind of been guessing at as far as what was actually happening and what the numbers actually meant. But in this episode, I hope to get that information across so everybody can be knowledgeable and be sure that you're doing the right thing if you are doing programming on one of these 8, 9, or 10-speed transmissions. So let's get into it. Again, we're talking about the 8-speed 8L90 transmission that's found in the Chevy pickup trucks, similar for the 9 and 10 speeds. Again, they are problematic. They have lots of issues. I don't know all the internal mechanical fault issues as well as the 6-speed transmissions. Again, we do a ton of the 6 speeds in these trucks as well, but I think the 6 speeds are just much more common to find in the trucks. So by volume, we see a lot more of those. But as far as the 8 speeds are equipped, they have their own set of problems and they seem to fail just as much. So again, I can't speak to the mechanical failures of these as much. but I do know they fail and they've got to be programmed. Now, the thing is on these that makes them, well, there's a lot of things that makes them different than a 6-speed, but as far as programming goes, the main difference here on an 8-speed, 9-speed, 10-speed, the transmission control module is external from the module, right? So all the 6 speeds that we've done, whether that be in the trucks or in the front wheel drive applications, the control module is inside the transmission, right? It's part of the solenoid assembly that's bolted to the valve body, the TECM, right? That is not the case in these 8 speeds. The transmission control module is up on the firewall of the trucks near the brake booster, external module. So that means if you replace a transmission, you're not replacing the control module, where with the 6 speeds, you are replacing the control module. So you have to program that module to match the vehicle, right? Put the VIN and the calibration in. You're not doing that here. The module's staying with the truck. I mean, unless you're replacing it. And I've had a couple shops do a TCM replacement on these as kind of like a Hail Mary, but I don't think it resolved their issue. I have not seen a transmission control module fail on one of these. Doesn't mean they can't, but usually it's the transmission itself that we're dealing with. But anyways, you still have to do programming, even though the module's not being replaced. The way that they have these transmissions set up is very similar to something you're probably familiar with, is the solenoid strategy that you find on Ford transmissions. And they've been doing this for a long time, since 2008 or somewhere around there. So we've been seeing this on Fords where there's a number that is on a sticker on the side or the top of the trans, and it matches a number that's stamped onto the valve body itself, and you program that number in, or you program in the file that corresponds to that number into the controlling module, powertrain control module, transmission control module, whatever it is. And that's how it's set up on Fords too. The control module is external for the trans. So if you replace the transmission, you've got to tell that module, hey, we've got a new transmission in here. And you're going to use the number, the solenoid strategy, to update the information within the module. And that corresponds to flow rates of the control solenoids that are located within the transmission. Same thing here, same idea, is we have electronic solenoids that are going to control flow rate through the transmission. And they actually test these on the bench before they install them into the valve body, and they measure current versus a pressure data point, and then they record that. They stamp the number on the back of the solenoid itself, and then they record that file and load it to the GM server. So that specific valve body has specific solenoids and specific flow rates saved to it. And I'll get into what that number is exactly, but there is a file stored for a valve body that was built for a specific transmission stored on GM's server. And that's essentially what we're going to be programming into this transmission control module when the transmission is replaced, so that that module knows the exact flow rates for that particular valve body, and they can shift correctly. So if you don't update this when you replace a transmission, you can have shifting problems. And I will say on these 8 speeds, if things are not done correctly, you will have shifting problems. I think on a lot of the Fords, at least the 6 speeds, you could not program a number in, and a lot of the times you'd get lucky and they'd shift pretty much okay. I can say that because I have a lot of transmission shops that I ended up working with that they weren't even aware that you were supposed to be doing that. They were just sending them out the door, and they rarely had issues. There are some Ford rebuilders that just throw in, if the flow rates of the solenoids are 1 through 5, they put in all 3 so they can never be off more than 2, and they're fine. They shift okay. On these 8-speed transmissions, it's, in my opinion, it's more sensitive than that. And if you don't do all this correctly, you're going to have some issues with these things. So we want to make sure that we're updating these correctly so the performance of the transmission is good. Now, that being said, these transmissions can have their own problems beyond the incorrect programming. But our goal when we go to the shops is to get all of the programming done correctly and then document it, which is kind of why I'm going through this, because I wanted to make sure, are we doing everything correctly to alleviate any issues that could be related to programming? Because there can be. You can have shifting issues that you either caused or didn't remedy by not programming and doing all the steps correctly. So that's why I'm here. That's why I'm talking about this. Of course, beyond that, the transmission can have its own problems, which makes these just a mess. But we're going to make sure we're doing our part of it correctly. So I mentioned that they're similar to the Fords with the Ford solenoid strategy on these transmissions. I think GM, just like the transmission itself, got a little over-engineered, overly complicated as far as the setup that they have. So I'm going to do my best to explain it here, and I had to do a little bit of learning because I didn't quite understand all of this, but there is some information out there pointing you towards what is what. Now, if you go into the programming, it's going to ask you a different number depending on what you selected you replaced. Okay, it's because you go into the programming through TLC, and I would suggest, this is the first thing, you're going to have options when you click on transmission, and sometimes in these trucks, you'll select the RPO code. The MYC is a 6-speed, and the M5U, or I believe M5X, is the 8-speed transmission. And if you select the M5U, which is the most common 8-speed, it will ask you if you want to do programming or if you want to run MVCM operations. And I learned that the MVCM stands for mechanical characterization and virtual matching, if anyone cares about that. I always select programming, and here's why. If you do the MVCM operations, you can update the solenoid strategy, if you will, in a couple different ways. But if you select programming, you're not only going to do that same thing, you're going to update the solenoid strategy. It's also going to check the software itself for updates in the TCM. And I can tell you this is really important. And I missed this on a vehicle a few years ago where I was just doing the update to the numbers, the solenoid numbers. It's the TUN or the PUN, and we'll get into what exactly those are. But I didn't check the actual module for a software update. I skipped over that because I didn't click the right thing. So when I go into TLC, I always click programming because it's going to have you do both. It's going to check the module for software updates, the actual TCM, to say, hey, did GM release any updates to the software that runs this thing? And it's going to have you match the transmission to the TCM as well. So you're going to do both. So I always click programming. Now, if you already know the software is up to date, you can do the MVCM. There's also an option for setup, which is a fast learn. We'll talk about that. But anyways, I always click programming. Now, once you're in there, it's going to ask you what you did. Did you replace the transmission? Did you replace the valve body? Or are you refreshing the characterization data? So usually what we are doing is we have either replaced the valve body or we've replaced the transmission. Now, depending on which option you select, it's going to ask you for a different number. One of them is a TUN, transmission unique number, and one of them is a PUN, part unique number. Okay, so if you select transmission and replace, it's going to ask you for the TUN. Where you're going to find that is on the passenger side of the transmission on a white sticker, and there's going to be a number there. Hopefully that sticker is legible. Much like the Fords and their solenoid strategy sticker, it's just black ink on a white tag, and it can be painted over, it can be rubbed off, it can be damaged. Lots of things can happen to this number. So hopefully it's visible, but it's there on the passenger side of the transmission. You use this number if the transmission is replaced, transmission unique number. Now, if the valve body is replaced, it's going to ask you for a PUN, part unique number. That number is stamped onto the valve body itself. Now, it shows you pictures in TLC of where these are, and it describes what they are. Going into this, I didn't fully understand what each number actually meant and the relationship to each other. I just knew, okay, if I'm doing a valve body, I'm doing the PUN. If I'm doing the transmission, I'm doing the TUN. But interestingly enough, and after doing some reading, there's a relationship between the two of them that's going to be stored on GM's server. Oh, and one other thing to note, if you're entering these numbers, make sure to use caps lock. I've had issues where if you don't capitalize the letter, it doesn't recognize the number that you put in. So put caps lock in when you're entering these numbers. The PUN, the part unique number that's on the valve body. And another note here for this, if a valve body is replaced, now obviously that number is on the valve body, but a lot of times for us, they call us after the pan's already on and they say, hey, can you come program this? And we're like, well, do you have the number? The number for the new valve body, it's actually on the bag that the valve body came in. It's not like a separate sticker. You don't get a little card or anything like that. It is on the bag that the valve body came in, which is usually in the trash. So then I tell them, well, find that bag and get me the number, or you got to drop the pan to get the number off the valve body. So keep that in mind as well, that you need to be aware of where the number is and take a picture of that beforehand so that you can program it in when you get to this point. But that part unique number that is on the valve body is the actual reference to the flow rates of the solenoids installed in that valve body. Okay. I am happy to have Automotive Seminars as a sponsor for the show. Now, if you're not familiar, Automotive Seminars is a diagnostic technician training company. They've got a website that there'll be a link to in the show notes. And what they offer is top-notch training to technicians like us in the field. I've been taking their training courses for years and have got a ton of benefit out of it. They've got top-notch instructors, John Thornton, Scott Shotton, Scott Manna, and every other month they've got a 2-night course that you can sign up for. Join in, ask questions, and afterwards, you've paid for the course, you can access a recorded version whenever you want. You can rewatch the class 2 years later in case you wanted some details on it. And that is a fantastic feature. So make sure to check out the website to see what courses they have available and what's coming up in the future. The TUN, transmission unique number on the side of the transmission, does not have an actual stored value for flow rates. It is just an identification for a particular transmission, like the plant, the build date, and other information about that specific transmission. You know, the actual physical component that's identifying that transmission. So if I'm entering the TUN, let's say the transmission is replaced, how are we getting specific flow rate data? Well, on GM's server, they have what they're calling, and I'm not making this up, this is in service information, you can look it up. They have a genealogy tree for a given VIN number. They're going to have a TUN that's linked to it, transmission unique number. And for that TUN, they're going to have a PUN that is linked to it, a part unique number. Okay, so each transmission has a valve body that is tied to it in the cloud, in their server, in what they're calling a genealogy tree. And when that is installed into a transmission and programmed through TLC, that is linked to a specific VIN number, right? So you have the VIN number of the truck, you have the transmission that is installed, and within that transmission, you have a valve body that is installed on that particular transmission, okay? And once I read up on this a little bit, it made more sense, because if I replace a valve body, say we have a transmission, it's been in the truck for 80,000 miles, the shop decides we're going to put a valve body in it, that's going to fix it. We come and we put the PUN number in. What that does is that updates the valve body, the flow rate data in relationship to that TUN on their server, right? So stored on the server for GM, that transmission unique number now has a different PUN linked to it. And it's also stored for that VIN. But, and I don't have 100% confirmation on this, but based on what I read, this is how this works. If you were to take that transmission and put it into another vehicle, and you were to use the TUN on the side of it, it would update it with the correct valve body information, right? On their server, the TUN and the PUN have been linked. Now, again, I don't have access to their server. I don't know if that's 100% accurate, but based on what I read, if the programming is done properly, when a specific component is replaced, like a valve body, and that transmission is moved to another truck, it should have the correct flow rate data linked to it. It should, right? And that is where, I started digging into this because I had a lot of questions. And unfortunately, we do have shops that put in used 8-speeds. Or, this could even be true of a rebuilt one, right? If you buy a new transmission from GM, it's going to have a TUN on the side of it. That's what you're going to use to program it. Somewhere along the build process, the PUN, which has the actual flow rate data stored in it, has been linked to that new TUN so that when you go to program it, it has all the right data. At least that's my understanding of it. But are all of the rebuilt transmissions getting stored properly on the GM server? I can't say that with 100% accuracy. I don't know. And if you get a used transmission, is it possible somebody threw a valve body in there and didn't program it correctly? It's definitely possible. So in that situation, if you want to be 100% accurate about the information that's getting programmed into it, you should use the PUN, the number on the valve body. And I'm going to be telling shops that from now on. Hey, if we're putting in a used transmission and even a rebuilt, and I suppose we could, look into where's the rebuild coming from. But I'm going to say, hey, if you want to do this correctly, we need the number off the valve body. Drop the pan, get that number. We'll program that in. So that way we know that the flow rates are going to be correct for that transmission. Because the TUN doesn't necessarily hold it. We're just relying that the PUN that's linked to it on their server is correct. And if that gets a little confusing, look it up in service information. It makes a little bit more sense. But we have two different numbers, which makes this overly complicated. And all of this is stored in what they're calling a genealogy tree on the GM server. So either way, get that number in there, and then you're going to go through the programming. Again, I select programming. It will update the software if needed, and then it will update the characterization data in the TCM and on the server as well. So again, that VIN number is going to have a different TUN/PUN linked to it on the GM server based on what you selected. So after you're done with that part of the programming, there's another step that I would encourage everybody to do on these transmissions. Now, if you're in the shop, you're doing the replacement, you should definitely do this. But we do the mobile programming, and we don't do the actual replacement of the transmission. We don't always see the repair all the way to the final step. We're just coming in to do the programming, right? There's a fast learn that with the 6-speeds, we honestly skip. We don't do it. I don't think it's necessary on the 6-speeds. We do so many 6-speed transmissions. You go out and test drive them, run it through the gears a few times. It'll be fine. You don't need to do the fast learn on the GM trucks, in my personal opinion. I know it's in the service info, and we put a disclaimer in our invoices like, hey, shop's responsible if they want to do this, but take it for a test drive, verify fluid level. They're fine. I don't think that's true with the 8-speed transmissions. I think the fast learn is a necessary part if you don't want shift quality issues after you're done. And this can be the shifting actually driving, but even just going into gear with these 8-speeds, you can have issues if this fast learn is not done on these. Now, again, we can leave this to the shop, but it's an area where we've had issues with the transmission. And of course, if there's any shifting issues, we're getting blamed first that we didn't do the programming correctly. But in the case of these 8-speeds, it's been me a couple times. I didn't update the software, right? That was one I mentioned a couple of years ago that I just missed that. I didn't do it. And that ended up fixing the issue. Or I didn't do the fast learn, and I didn't used to do the fast learn on these 8-speed transmissions, but a few times the shift issues that were present were corrected with a fast learn. Now, I'm not saying they always are going to be. Sometimes they're not, especially if you're putting in a used transmission. But in order for us to do it correctly and alleviate any issues that we are capable of, we have to do this step and have to document it. Like, all of this needs to be documented, so then they come to us and say, hey, it's shifting weird. Hey, look, we did all of this. Here's the proof. But this fast learn can actually alleviate some of these problems. Now, Something to consider on this is it does need to be full of fluid before you do this. It's also got to be up to temperature. It's got to be hot. They have you get it up to 75 degrees Celsius. So that can take a little while. You can just sort of power brake it in gear to get it up to temperature, but you need to make sure, okay, is this thing okay to start and run? Is it full of fluid? Is it ready to go? So you're going to want to warm it up before you begin, or it won't let you start. Some tips here for this fast learn procedure. Now you can run this through TLC, you can run it through the scan tool. Follow the prompts on the tool exactly. For instance, don't start the process while the engine is running. It will cue you when to start the engine. If you start it while it's running, it'll fail. And here's the big thing that you want to remember about this fast learn. And this is true of other like 6-speed transmissions as well. If it fails the fast learn, you will need to do a power cycle of the module, meaning turn the key off, wait 60 seconds, and turn it back on. If you don't do it, it puts the transmission into a weird neutral state, and it will just continue to fail the fast learn over and over and over again. So you'll need to power cycle it in order for it to reset in order to attempt it again. But follow the prompts exactly for this fast learn. Now, be aware, even when you get this going after you've got it warmed up, this can take upwards of 10 minutes to complete this. This is a lengthy process. It does a clutch purge, so you want to make sure that the brake works properly. It has you put the parking brake on as well. Follow all those instructions. It takes a while. You're just sitting there on the brake, waiting for it to go through this fast learn process. Now, this is also really important, and I wasted some time here and I thought I screwed something up, or I thought there was an issue with the transmission. You get the fast learn done and you immediately go out and drive it. Don't do that. It's going to shift terribly, or not move at all. That's the other thing that might happen. When it's done with this fast learn, and this is true of the 6 speeds as well, it puts that transmission into this weird neutral state. I've had it also where it moves, but it just does not shift correctly at all. You need to do a power down of that module. And I tell shops, leave the key off for 10 minutes. I don't think it's actually that long, but just as a, make sure that we're covering the time correctly. I tell them, wait 10 minutes before you turn the key on and go drive this thing. Give it a power down cycle. It may not move or it may not shift correctly until this is done. So just keep that in mind. If you do that quick learn, turn the key off, wait, make sure the module power cycles properly, because it puts it into some strange state after that fast learn either fails or completes properly. It doesn't seem to matter. And then you can think that, oh, this transmission is junk or there's something seriously wrong with it, when it's just in this state that it gets into after the learn. So hopefully that'll help you avoid a little bit of a headache there if you haven't run into that before. All right, so that's what I've got for GM 8-speed transmission. Again, the 9 and the 10 speeds are going to be similar. They'll have that TUN or PUN number. I haven't done a whole lot of those again. Someone also did mention to me, or I read it somewhere, that the 10-speed transmission does not have a PUN number stamped to it, and so you need the number off of the documentation that the valve body comes with. Again, haven't experienced that myself, but so would be something to consider as well, as you may not be able to get it off the valve body. Not sure if that's 100% accurate or not, but keep an eye out for that. But that's what I got for you. So hopefully that was helpful. If you got more information on those transmissions, you got some experience, anything I'm missing on there, I'd love to hear it. But other than that, let's all get out there, start fixing the world one car at a time.